Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Signal Sciences. Detect security threats in minutes before it affects your customers with Datadog's newest security monitoring product. Teams can investigate security threats and malicious activity in real time using 75+ out-of-the-box detection rules and detailed observability data, metrics, traces, and logs in one integrated platform. See it for yourself by signing up for a free trial and receive a Datadog t-shirt by visiting securityweekly.com/Datadog. By connecting to your code repository, Accurix generates a topology across your full stack to reveal risks so that you can harden your architecture. It also scans code for violations against compliance and security standards to enforce best practices. In addition, Accurix develops threat models using vulnerability feeds, IAM privileges, and other data to predict potential breach paths. Learn how easy it is to get started with Accurix at securityweekly.com/Accurix.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. I'm your host, Mike Shima, joined by Matt Alderman and John Kinsella. Do you have a specific guest or topic that you want us to cover on one of the shows? Submit your suggestions for guests by visiting securityweekly.com/guests and completing the form. We review suggestions monthly and will reach out to you once reviewed. Security Weekly is ramping up our webcast and technical training schedule for the rest of 2020. In September, you can find out why traditional data security can't be zero trust, as well as learn how to reduce the blast radius of your cloud infrastructure. Visit securityweekly.com/webcast to see what we have coming up, or visit securityweekly.com/on-demand to view our previously recorded webcasts. And now this brings us into bugs. So it's not so much that we took a week off and all these bugs queued up. It's just there's a lot of bugs out there. And John, you already alluded to this a little bit in our previous discussion with Frank. You have an article here from Krebs just talking about the recent Patch Tuesday from Microsoft. So take us into that real quick.
Yeah, it wasn't. Don't forget, it wasn't just Microsoft. He covered a lot of good stuff in there, including it's been 2 months in a row now that there's been no patches for Flash. Yay! Sorry.
Flash is going to end of life, right?
Yeah, and at the end of the year, yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah, I need to put some levity into this because we've got so much stuff going on here. But yeah, so Microsoft Patch Tuesday. I don't know if you saw the update I threw in here, Mike. But so first was, as you said, or corrected me, 7 months in a row with 100 or more security patches. I think it's 4 months in a row with 120 or more. And it turns out this morning, at least it hopped on my radar this morning, one of the vulnerabilities is something called Xero Login, another marketed vulnerability. Which is basically someone's figured out that you can zero out the password and the validation, and then be able to reset a password on a domain controller. CVS, perfect 10 out of 10. So it's interesting. I know these guys are going to so much good stuff, but it gets sort of troubling at some point. You know, I know they've got a bunch of legacy codes too, but if the big guys can't get this right, how can we expect the small ones to? So I don't know.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Some of the big bugs are Exchange, which has been around forever, SharePoint, which has been around forever. Again, we were talking a little bit about the technical debt aspects of this. I mean, you're pulling a lot of legacy stuff along the way, trying to enhance it, and boom, critical vulnerability sitting in these platforms still.
Yeah, and I think, and Frank gave a good answer too, and as you guys are kind of pointing out again here too, that legacy aspects. We've even talked about like Win32k, just that alone right there. If there's a vuln in that, you have local privilege escalation. And I think one of my things to point out here too is that it doesn't necessarily worry me so much that there's a huge amount of numbers, because it also indicates that now you have Microsoft has the maturity to be able to track and label all of these as actual vulns and provide a degree of transparency that they're there. And it's not that you have to apply 100 plus patches. You just need to apply a handful of patches, depending on if it's SharePoint, Exchange, etc. And it's more about what's the patch that's missing that you haven't applied. That's what's going to be exploited rather than just the actual volume. So I do think it's great to point out and to be questioning, is this an indicator that our tooling, our architecture, our designs maybe aren't as secure as they should be? Are we dealing with legacy? But it doesn't necessarily put me, it doesn't make me too worried about Microsoft, knowing that they have things like the Surface, knowing that they have a lot of compiler and memory hardening that they're applying to all of their builds on a regular basis.
But
yeah, I mean, look, part of this is they're finding the vulnerabilities and we're getting them fixed, which means that their security program that they spent a lot of money on is actually finding and fixing stuff. I think that's a good thing in general. I mean, it's better than this stuff not getting discovered and becoming a 0-day somewhere else. What I find interesting is when you look at the CVE numbers across the stretch, there is a long amount of time in between some of these. I mean, some of these CVEs go back to 0688, and the one of the more recent ones is 16,875, right? So that CVE's been hanging around there for a while without a patch.
It's I can only give so much credit to the there's legacy code and all those things, because at the same time we said that if you have a large security team and they're fixing every month 100 and 100 and 100, so that means this year we're going to have, well, pretty much guaranteed over 1,000 security patches from Microsoft by the end of the year. It's not the first year. They've been doing this for a while, maybe not these numbers. You'd expect at some point that curve to start dropping down. So that's why I get that this is old product, but I think where my concern is not so much just the number, but that there was a really great talk. I don't know if we got it into one of our shows, Mike, but you had that talk that you mentioned before in the show notes from a guy over at SNCC, man. I had it here to talk about. But basically looking at different ways to actually look at the metrics of your security program. And I think most of us would agree that you want some sort of a trend down. And again, I know Microsoft isn't the only company like this. We'll probably find an example from someone else in a few weeks. And I know we're all doing great stuff and things are getting better, but at the same time, I think when I start seeing things like this, the reason I'm reacting like this is I need to ask more serious questions of what's going on. And so that's sort of where I'm coming from on this.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And what I would look here too is, are we getting better by the classes of bugs that are showing up or not, as opposed to raw numbers? Because we could also look at, for example, Chrome and Android. I think just this month, Android has yet another problem in their media framework library. Again, one of those notorious areas that's really bad. But even though there's a bug, and I think it's high as opposed to critical, it's still bad. But they've also put sandboxing around that media framework, just so that when there is a vuln, it's getting, it's not as impactful. Same with Chrome, that even if Chrome doesn't have 100 vulns every month, but it does have one or two that tend to be high and critical. We've had some critical Chrome vulns over this year already. Those are the ones that'll be exploited, but it's also just as easy to patch those, or it should be, as it is to patch the others. And so I guess where I'm going with that too is kind of riffing on what you're pointing out and trying to frame it in the sense of, or looking at it from the perspective of, what are the vuln classes and categories, and are those categories getting better or worse? Or do you have some secondary controls, some architecture changes that are just saying, yep, we've got all of this horrible font parsing or image parsing or all of these areas that are going to have tons of bugs that still have yet to be discovered, but the impact of them hopefully is actually going down. And that's where I would be really curious.
And that talk, just to mention it, because I think it's really, really great. I've been talking to a lot of folks about it. Is Human Trust Enough by Patrick Dubois over at SNCC. It's on YouTube. It's a really great talk. He sort of he refers to it as a man, my words are failing me today. He refers to it as a sort of he's collecting a lot of slides and information from other folks and covering that in 35 minutes. But I'd highly recommend it for folks to watch if they're in this metric space.
Yeah, we'll drop a link in the Discord, and it's great. Frank also mentioned, for example, Clint. He has the TLDR newsletter. We talked to him as well a couple months ago, and he did a presentation as well about here's what other people are talking about. Here are some themes that come from it. And John, you're just mentioning this from Patrick Dubois. Did a very similar thing, very focused on that human aspect of security, which is a great callback to our discussion with Frank.
Now you could be Android and have a bunch of bugs, but not fix any of them. At least Microsoft's trying to fix them.
Yes, thank you for saying that, and that's kind of where I was going to begin to go. So let's see. Let's pick on. We'll pick on Microsoft or for Google for one other thing, and then we'll start to turn to some more optimistic or different looks. But I threw in here. I have a personal editorial snooze every time I see cross-site scripting. But I did want to mention one particular vulnerability the researcher found. It was in Google Maps. They got a $10,000 bounty of it, but it was very old school in the sense that terminating, rather than an HTML tag, terminating a CData tag, and then throwing in SVG payload into that to demonstrate an exploit, which, if anything, Google Maps is one of those things that's built on a lot of XML or KML, for those of you like the reference to the keyhole satellites and the keyhole markup language. So it was just a great place for old school vuln to find a very relevant and $10,000 relevant type of finding. So I did want to highlight that. The other thing too, and before we go, one other thing, and then we'll go into a bunch more bugs, is Google also has revisited and pretty much more than doubled a lot of their product risk abuses, their bug bounties for that. And I wanted to highlight that because we've talked about OAuth's top 10, or as I just mentioned, cross-site scripting, but there's a lot of bugs that we're going to talk about with crypto and SQL injection in a little bit. But there's also a lot of ways to just abuse or misuse functionality. And I think it's really cool that Google has added this as an explicit component of their bounty program so they can identify what are some code changes we should make that should minimize the way products can be abused. In other words, target other users of the product or data within that product. So it's a really good angle I just wanted to not forget about.
The interesting thing about this is how they set the bounties, the different payouts for this. They use probability and impact, and they basically created a risk matrix and said, high probability, high impact, you get up to 13,377 or 337. It creates this really interesting matrix. How do you determine probability and impact? If you're on the bug bounty side, right, and you're trying to figure out, what could I get paid out? This is a pretty complex little system to go, well, I think it's pretty probable, or I think the impact's high, but maybe Google doesn't. Is this an interesting way for payouts to be structured?
Yeah, there's definitely, and I think they even have the phrase, the payouts are at our discretion, which is actually not uncommon or it's not common to Google. It's not uncommon within these types of programs. But your point is still well made in the sense of, does this get one person? Does it get unauthenticated, interactions with the site? Does it only, if you can DM someone, only your followers? There's a lot of things that definitely come up there that can be questionable about bug bounties. So we should probably do another deep dive on some future episode just about the ins and outs of bounties themselves. But before we do that, let's go back to John. I think this is a good lead in to some of the other articles we'll go in about a very small, I think, crypto flaw in just a backup a tool that you found on Full Disclosure. Yeah.
So I've used Backblaze for years. Their backup side, I think, is not so much their storage side. I think most people know of them. If not, they do all sorts of really great reporting on failures around their disks. They basically created an S3 competitor, but they also have a backup product, which is obviously my favorite. But they had a post on Full Disclosure, or someone else had a post on Full Disclosure. It turns out after they had, speaking of bug bounties, Backblaze had one. Someone was poking around, found a few things, and one of them was a remote code execution. And it was interesting to actually read through this and think about. You could see that their developers had tried to stop something like this happening. Right, there was some testing there around is the domain you're coming from one of their Backblaze domains? They were actually looking for a signature in the binary to see if it was, or a string in the binary, not a signature, to see if it was their binary before executing it. But still, with all those attempts, there was ability that you can actually spoof, say, a DNS, do a DNS spoof, get the packages to download both your say what the correct version is that should be running, and then once it realizes there's a version to update, to download that binary and then to run that binary, which as a backup system, those things usually run as root or a system on Windows and Linux and Unix, Mac. Yeah. So it was interesting to see them try this, and then also I think you want to go down the path of they were also not doing cert validation if it was coming from one of these magical domains which they cared about, or that they thought they cared about. So interesting, thumbs up for good try, but maybe actually use the security tools a little better next time.
Yeah, I have a little bit of the what was it? The curl opt, SSL, verify host, verify peer. I have a little bit of PTSD just from seeing that in so many, Android apps and so many PHP apps that just are using curl library. Absolutely love that library. But once you're disabling cert checking, why are you bothering with HTTPS anyway? And that's just one of the horrible things here. And you also mentioned too, they're looking for a string as sort of an indicator that this is from us, when they could have just been checking a signature. So there were two just very fundamental, very simple solved problems, I will even say, of crypto. How to verify where is this binary coming, and is this actually a binary that we has a provenance from us? It's been signed. And I thought that was a great thing for you to find, John, because it ties in nicely to another tool from some academics called CRYLOGGER. So basically, this is a tool to detect crypto misuses dynamically. And a bunch of academics created this open source tool. We have some links in the show notes, and just threw it against, I think, 1,700 or so apps in the Android ecosystem. And what they found were a lot of misuses. And what was really nice to me, that stood out to me, is that I think, one, read their paper. It has around 24 or so different misuse rules for crypto that I think are just very informative in general. But two of them stand out. One is Rule 24 and 25, not verifying the host names in the certs, or just not verifying the certs at all. And what these academics found were a healthcare app with 1 million more downloads that wasn't validating certs, a music streaming app that also wasn't validating certs, and a newspaper app and another video streaming app that weren't validating certs. So they were still finding these types of flaws within the Play Store. And not just picking on Android here, this is just what they were looking at. So I'm sure there are plenty of items in the iTunes store that still have these same problems.
Yeah, on those two rules, I particularly liked their actual phrasing. For example, R24, don't verify host names in SSL in trivial ways. So,
Yes.
That's the, yeah.
Do it in complex and convoluted ways that could still possibly be bad, but yeah. Yes, the language is great. And another thing that some of the other, they also found a couple different apps and that were just using constant passwords, hard-coded passwords, which again shouldn't be doing. And what was interesting there too is that they didn't. The researchers did reach out to these applications libraries that they were doing some analysis on, and in this case, it was interesting. The developers responded that saying they don't have a plan to fix these problems because a privilege escalation attack is necessary to access the data. Basically, they're saying our threat model, we care about, you have to get physical access to the phone, or you have to be able to do some type of privilege escalation on the phone before you can get to this hard-coded secret key, which, okay, sure, that is perhaps a mitigating circumstance, but that's definitely not a strong control, especially if, as Matt was pointing out, especially if a lot of Android systems aren't up to the latest patches. It's probably pretty much guaranteed you have a local privilege escalation on that particular device.
Yeah, and if you don't, you're just going to send them an SMS text and get it anyways.
That's absolutely correct. Yes. Yeah. So that was interesting to see on, a great cryptography rating there. So highly recommend, just even if you aren't building Android apps, take a look at the paper just to look at those types of misuses. And as John pointed out, the rules are pretty entertainingly described. A lot of don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, which is also where BLURtooth got into the news again for a BLURtooth vuln, which again, a named vuln, although I didn't look to see if actually somebody got the domain for it. But this is a case where it was a flaw in key exchanges, or basically you have a BLURtooth that could have two modes, essentially, BLURtooth low energy or a basic rate. And these two modes have different expectations or different ways of exchanging keys. But what the researchers found here is a way that they said, in this cross, what do they call it? The cross transport key distribution, if I just remember what the acronym was. Basically, you can say, here, use these keys for these two types of communications, but we're actually going to overwrite some of your other authentication keys or downgrade the security of the key. So basically dropping this pairing of Bluetooth devices to a lowest common denominator. So kind of interesting there. And I guess the only other thing I'll point out, though, is that this is actually essentially addressed in Bluetooth spec 5.1, which the spec is actually already on to 5.2. But I am curious, what does this mean for all of the firmware out there on 4.0 up to 5.0, and would it ever be fixed, and how could it ever be fixed in some of these devices?
Well, they're not sure. There's no patch currently available, and they don't know when it will be. And there are features in 5.1, but I didn't see any guidance on what are some of those features that need to be turned on to prevent this. So it gets interesting. It's in the 5.1 spec, but may not be on by default, is kind of how I read this. So what do I need to do if I'm running 5.1 to make sure I'm good, but all your 4 and 5 devices are just hosed?
Yeah, it was actually kind of funny because I did dive into the 5.1 spec trying to figure out what is the recommendation here. And basically the 5.1 spec essentially says, don't let keys overwrite other authentication keys. And if you have a high level, if you have a, I can't remember what the term was, I'm trying to find my notes, but if you have a high security key, don't overwrite that high security key with a low security key. So it's basically 5.1 says what the flaw is here, and don't do this. So I guess we need a rule 27 or something to throw in there.
Is there like a checkbox somewhere that says don't allow low security key to overwrite high security key? I mean, how do you turn it on? It's
actually when you're looking at specifications, it's not so much prescriptive. You have to really be paying close attention to the specification to be saying, oh, we should be doing this. Or there's also the language when you're talking about RFCs, should we be doing this or must we be doing this? Or just what happens if we don't? There's still some points about are all these devices really fixed it in the implementation? But then too, even if, let's say there is a patch for these older devices, how many of them are even supported, and how many of them actually can be flashed and updated with firmware? So I think it's a really interesting scenario for IoT or those smaller profile devices to be able to basically to patch themselves. So what was else? There was also then, I found another, speaking of tons of bugs, found another small conference. This was a virtual conference being conducted in Ireland, but some researchers from Germany went back to look at some smartwatches that are marketed for kids. And as as we alluded to, I think in the top of the show, smartwatch vulns have been known for quite a while, and there's researchers said, well, if we know these vulns and have been out there and people have been warned, and now I'm losing my words, and the developers should know better, they went and looked and see what kind of vulns exist. And lo and behold, they found a ton of vulns: SQL injection, client-side password hashing, weak authorization, even one app, and these are all in production apps, was using RC4 encryption. So a lot of stuff that just shouldn't be the case in modern, call it DevOps or just modern application design. So it was really interesting to see. And I wanted to highlight it because, again, very accessible paper, great reading just in terms of approaching a reverse engineering. So if you enjoy reverse engineering, taking things apart, read it from that, as well as the presentation that they gave. It was really quick, 15 minutes, easily digestible presentation. So from the communication perspective, I liked it from that perspective too. So I'm not sure if you had been looking at that or if there's anything else that either of you wanted to highlight on any of the bugs or any of the angles of the bugs we've been talking about so far, from Microsoft to Google to Android to smartwatches.
No, but I this last article is interesting, right? The kind of the where the malware and ransomware attacks are going, right? Microsoft's in the list. Pulse Connect, which I thought was interesting, more from Pulse Security on the VPN side, but Microsoft's got two in here, and then Citrix as the fourth. I mean, as we see people going remote, these critical vulnerabilities are also an attack path into ransomware attacks, and again, there's Microsoft, 2 of the 4 on the list.
Yep. Microsoft 2 on the 4. And one of the things that was interesting is that there was some information from this article, also from some checkpoint research. And what was it that there were some vulnerabilities from 2020 used, but there's also some vulns from 2017 and earlier, as well as one of the vulns was 7 years old that's being exploited. Yeah. So I think that's really to the point of, yes, we definitely want to be pushing on the Microsofts of the world, and seeing if we're seeing 100 plus vulns a month show up, what does that actually mean? Let's get, is that a metric that means that the SDLC or the SDL is being successful or not? But even if we're pushing on Microsoft or Mac or Linux for that matter to be patching promptly and making patches available, if those patches aren't installed for 7 years, let alone 3, that is definitely a different problem that needs to be addressed more on the people and process side for the organizations running the software.
Yeah. Depends, right? I mean, some of these, especially it's one thing to know you've got a vulnerability. We're switching from talking about DevSecOps to the patch side of things, but it's one thing to know that, to have someone knowing you have a vulnerability, but do you have a person in your organization who is checking for vulnerabilities across everything? And I don't mean this to push a product. I mean from the exact opposite point of view of, when's the last time your NetScaler was patched? Probably, or when you thought about patching it, right? Probably when some sort of functionality broke, or you're on a call with a support team, or it doesn't have to be a NetScaler, it could be a Cisco router or Arista switch, whatever you have. You're usually not going to do software updates on those unless there's something significant going on, like an O-Day from Cisco. So it's an interesting area, right? And that's, I think that's part of, again, coming back to our 100 patches a month. We've talked about how easy it can be to patch these things, but if something is in a critical place where someone's worried about, don't reboot that thing, we're not sure if it's going to come back up correctly, that's a bit of a problem, guys. But at the same time, sometimes it's not always that easy or people aren't always going to take it at face value of, we just need to apply the patch and we'll be fine. Especially if you're in a larger org that has some sort of change management window or change management process going on. And, I thank God I'm not in an org that has a change management process where you have that weekly meeting and you have to go through 100 patches just for one product or one vendor. But I don't know. I'm still, that's active on my mind, obviously. And how do we deal with these things?
So Pulse Secure gets a pass because it's a VPN, and who updates their VPN until you need VPN capacity. Yeah. Okay. But Citrix and Windows, come on.
Yeah, well, I think what you're bringing out now is that comes into that budget and resources aspect of security, right? Because, John, you were pointing out to the aspect of what's the threat here? Well, one, visibility. What do I even know what the asset inventory of what's running on my network? And then of everything running on my network, I got to prioritize them some way. And do I prioritize the Pulse that's sitting on the VPN that's external to everyone, or do I go after something that's internal, that's on a segmented network that doesn't even have a lot of sensitive data associated with it.
Because think about that example for a second. Frequently when folks go to Pulse is because they're looking for an easier VPN solution because they're understaffed, right? Every single pitch I see from a security vendor nowadays is talking about everyone's understaffed, so we need to make the tools easier. Okay, so we go to Pulse, and we know we have less security team, and that's why we're using that product. And now there's a vulnerability in it that needs to be patched, but we're already short-staffed, so who's going to take care of it? It's sort of feeding on itself, that little nasty loop.
Yeah, and I've got there's an article that I haven't, in a project out of MIT called scram.mit.edu, that purports to be a platform for prioritizing enterprise security investments. And beyond that headline, I actually don't know much more of the details, but it's in the backlog to look into, because something like that is to say, cool, we have 100 patches now. Which one do we prioritize? And I think this is where we've gone out of DevOps, as you noted, into the practical side, or more into the security operations side or patch management of IT. And we need to figure out how to plan for that. And that's an area that, I'm just throwing out there as a bookmark. So if listeners want to go and check that out and have some feedback for us, or if you're even considering adopting that, I'd be very curious. But just that's where we're also looking at this people aspect of fixing what our network looks like.
Yeah, I've actually been thinking about this general topic for the last few months. And in full disclosure, there's a startup there. I just haven't figured it out yet. But we've got all these DevOpsy tools which are telling you about all your vulnerabilities and all that type of stuff. Frequently, you're still left with a now what situation. So what do you do with, if I tell you that there's 50 vulnerabilities in your container image? Some of the tools out there nowadays like SNCC and Deep Source, I'm an advisor and investor in them, so just full disclosure. But some of these tools out there now are actually starting to do pull requests automatically for you and fix issues on the software side. But how do you rank these things? And if we've got you've got a scanner at the Kubernetes level, you've got a scanner at the container level, you've got a scanner at the image level, you've got a scanner on the source code level, you've got some other scanner. How do you juggle all this stuff and figure out, where do you start patching or where do you start fixing things? Which do you go to first? So
yeah, I was going to
hopefully
use that.
Well, SNCC just took $200 million, so maybe that's the next evolution of the platform. Congratulations.
And that's a crazy raise. Yeah.
Yeah.
And one of the things I was going to highlight there too is Frank brought up software composition analysis in the first segment, and what's really nice there is, to a degree, and you highlighted this, John, is that if the tool can actually just open the merge request for you, and all you have to do is click approve, that actually takes away a lot of the need for figuring out the prioritization. Because as long as you have good test coverage, so there is a little bit of a caveat there, but clicking on that approve is a lot easier than figuring out, of these 10 or 100 dependencies, which ones should I do that version bump, minor or major version, and it just goes to, cool, we're just going to keep on the latest and greatest, and and build out a robust testing infrastructure to do it. I don't know that there's such a similar thing in terms of managing your fleet of Windows or Mac systems or Linux systems or your containers, etc., to such a way that it can be so well tested as well as automated. So yeah, definitely. Hopefully, you're thinking long and hard about that good startup idea there, John.
Yeah, I'm not actually, but I've looked at it, thought about it. I'm like, no.
But there are solutions out there, John, that are trying to do aspects of this. So, I don't think it's completely not being addressed. I think it's still an evolution in some of these newer innovations that are happening in this space.
I know you've got a company in Denver there, or Colorado, working on some of that, but I think on the container side, it's really, at least from what I've seen, it's really not. But to go back, oh man, I had a thought there. To go back, I keep playing with this stupid wire stripper. I got it in a box over the weekend from Amazon, and I know I'm going to cut myself. Sorry, but there was, let's see, so you're talking, Mike, around patching, and there was something in there. Oh, well. Yeah, there's something there, I think, to be done further. We're talking about publicly. Someone go figure it out and go run with it. I've told a few folks now, there's a product here, go do it, and no one's done it yet. So
there is, and to a degree, I think, or at least this is me wanting to be optimistic, that if we look at like the AWS images, so AWS has their own container image or their own Linux that they're running, and Azure, for example, too, is that if you're following those, you're getting a lot of those system patches. And if you have a DevOps style of approach where you're burning down on a regular basis, tear down and redeploy systems and redeploy on top of the latest, then to a degree, just by that practice, you're worrying less about individual patching and more about what's the latest version deployed. So there's your asset inventory that's still quite important. And the follow-up question then, there's a new CVE out from Microsoft. How exposed are we? And if you can answer that question, what are we running and how exposed are we? That's probably a much more interesting question to be able to answer than just what's our patch story. I think they're related, but I would definitely go for the second part.
Totally with you. I remember what I mentioned. So back on the auto patch or the auto pull requests. So I got one over the weekend from Dependabot at GitHub, one of my projects there. I think there was a version bump in one of the nodes dependencies. Okay, cool. This is something where I'd been playing with Circle CI on it, and I know those tests are broken. So I've got a pull request on a project, which I haven't done a commit to for a few months. I'm not planning on using it for at least a few more months. Do I just accept this pull request and see what happens next time I go to run this in a few months? Or so I think that's just me, a hobby thing, but I think there's probably a good number of companies that are in that same position.
Indeed. And I think, don't want to keep you too much from your other hobbies. So you're going to, I assume, the wire strippers, you're taking some RJ45 and hooking up all those old modems you have, and your ADDT commands. So I want to say thanks again to John for joining, as well as you, Matt, for another great walk through the news of the week. This has been good. And I want to thank everyone else for joining us. We will see you next time on Application Security Weekly.